Simmons was barely listening because she already knew what the reports were going to tell her. The ground war for the planet the chua called Zvitia was going better than any projection they had made, and the journalists reporting back to the homefront had more than their fair share of incredible moments that were going to be replayed 1,000 times over on every news feed back home. The advanced special operations teams had performed with an almost perfect record. All the doubts about the battlefield usage of the chua Alligator Deep Strike mech walkers had been laid firmly to rest. Any questions about the effectiveness of Terran tank, heavy weapon, and infantry armor had been answered, and all answers were positive. In short, this wasn't a war at all. She firmly ignored the sight out of the corner of her eye, an irritant as of late. The Turinika Conclave ambassador was standing by the door, flanked by 2 guards and looking as downright miserable as always. She ignored him. He was beneath her contempt. As she watched the tactical readouts, half paying attention to the delivery of the general who was Zziaa's proxy, she was preparing to give the fleet's tactical situation. She went over the bullet points in her head. After the initial engagement in Helena and the massacre that had happened in this system, the fleet was rearing to go onwards. Without thinking, her head turned to look out of the viewport, towards a star that she had become very familiar with over the last 26 hours. It was a pale star, not unlike the trillions of others one could pinpoint in the darkness beyond. But that star's direction marked the direction she'd be turning the Antares and its fleet to. In that direction was a Mandeville Point, and beyond that Mandeville Point was Vral space. Her arms slowly crossed, and she stared out into the darkness. The chua homeworld was still being evacuated. Zvitia was already being cleansed of the Vral, and millions, if not billions, of slaves had been freed. The freed humans, if she was understanding the reports right, had been savagely treated in the last few years. The Vral had taken their hatred of their failure out on those poor souls. They were going to be brought back to Earth itself, or maybe Alpha Centauri if they did not want to go to the homeworld. The chua were already talking about relocating here. She knew there were several pictures captured of the enslaved chua, only hours after being freed in some areas, starting to dig at the ground. When they were asked what they were doing, they had, almost to an individual, said that it was time to start planting gardens again. She had thought it poetic, of course, but to the chua, this was an absolute statement. Simmons had already given permission for the chua to paint a mural based on one of the paintings in the forward deck mess hall. But that star, she was waiting for it. Every formerly chua republic system was in the hands of the Terran front now. The Vral had completely abandoned the last as well as the 2 planets there after the battle in the Zziaa system. For the first time in 90 years, Eziact, Zziaa, Shivru, and Azza knew existence without the Vral. She had always wondered what would happen the day that this occurred. She had a fear in the back of her mind that the chua would abandon the fight once their systems were back in their hands. That fear had been unfounded, and she felt ridiculous for even giving it a thought. In fact, it was all they could do to reject the requests of the freed chua to join up with the Terran front's military in many cases. She smiled to herself, her mind calling up the vid feeds of the chua in rags, demanding positions so that they could... Everyone was looking at her. Simmons blinked, then looked back at them all. "Planning the future, Field Marshal?" Admiral Graves said with a smile. "No, just lost in thought. No need for a search party." Her joke got them laughing, and she pulled her notepad up. "I'm guessing you're waiting to hear how my fleet is doing." Admiral Graves nodded to her. "Well, to say it simply, we're doing better than expected. After the engagement, we had around 60% of the fleet reporting damages, and only 15% reporting moderate damage." She flicked her finger on her datapad. "We have begun the process of sending back any ship that we ourselves cannot repair in the next 12 hours to full operational capacity. Unfortunately, we have lost several ships entirely." She placed her notepad on the table and uploaded her file so that all could see it on their own displays around the table. "As of right now, the fleet between our ships in the Azza system and here is operating at about 88%. We expect to be up to 92 in the next 6 hours. The docks for repairs are currently full, and there's a transport coming from Thermopylae that will rendezvous with us in the next 12 hours with pilots to replace those we lost in the strike craft wings." She pointed to a shorter man with salt and pepper hair, Admiral Venair, and he promptly took over. "We have already started the resupply of rounds to the fleet. Salvage teams are still bringing in the Vral wrecks. All things considered, it will take months to clean the system of them. Our priority?" he said, pausing as he spread his own file to the display. "Has of course been our own casualties. Those that are salvageable have been brought to Antares itself to be cycled into the repair bays. Those that are complete losses are few and far between." Several nods came from the table. The Vral had fought hard against the fleet, that much everyone knew. But the truth was the Vral couldn't afford to make sure a ship was dead anymore. The luxury of that kind of engagement was all on them now. She heard a chirp followed quickly by the translation in her ear, and she looked down the table at the brown-speckled Admiral Viratka. "System process perfect efficiency." Simmons nodded once at the chua. "Station core open hubs future process." "Where?" she asked Viratka, and turned her head to the system map as the chua zoomed in on the third planet, then motioned to a commander to her left. The commander was a tall man and had no issue simply pointing across the table. "Admiral Viratka has tasked me with arranging the salvage we can't take on board into 4 zones for easy processing." He pointed at the map of the system directly over the 4th planet. "We have already sent for an orbital reprocessor to be sent from Persephone Station in orbit of New Amsterdam in the Wolf 359 system. It will take some time to get here, a week at least, but once it does we can start processing the alloy from the Vral wrecks." He stood back up and nodded once at the table. "Once that occurs, 3 CV-5s are already en route from Thermopylae, as well as a cargo hauler to set up a defensive station and shipyard in orbit of Zvitia." He finished and crossed his arms behind his back. "How long until you'll be fully operational?" another officer asked. "When the cargo hauler comes, it will take the CV-5s less than 3 days to fully build the hull of the station itself to where work crews can begin installing equipment. A week to become fully operational as far as the station itself is concerned." The commander glanced at his notepad and then continued. "Once we receive the orbital processor, it will take less than a second week before we can actively begin laying hulls for destroyer tonnage or less." Simmons nodded approvingly, then she looked around the table. Seeing no one else with new information to relay, she tapped her fingers on the table in a precise rhythm and stood back as the displays slid down into their places, leaving the surface flat and smooth. "Well, Commander, you're going to be a busy man," she said, and the group laughed. He nodded to her with a grin on his face. "I do have regrets about leaving the fleet, but I have no regrets that I'll be doing my part to support it." The tall commander looked around the table and finally down to the diminutive chua admiral. He came to a stiff attention. "Permission to carry out my duties." The chua admiral came to his species' own version of attention and chirped once. The commander turned and began walking for the door as the rest of the group dispersed. Simmons once again turned, looking towards the viewport and her star in particular. She hadn't said the obvious, of course. That was something she didn't want to say, and she knew just as well as everyone else that the first person that said it was going to get slapped for their trouble. The Vral had lost nearly 30,000 ships to her losses of barely 600. The losses she had taken were already being replaced, but the losses the Vral had taken. She didn't want to say that this war was over already. She didn't want to say that this engagement had been so catastrophically decisive, but from what she knew about the Vral and their deployments along their border, it was hard to say it as anything but. She had just destroyed the Vral fleet along the Terran Vral frontier to a ship. It felt difficult not to tell any journalist nearby to tell everyone back home to start celebrating. The Antares fleet wasn't even the only fleet in Terran front space, and Antares' sister ships were standing by, waiting to be called up. "Is this how they felt when they invaded Antares?" she whispered to herself, and then realized she was putting herself in the Vral's shoes. If she had been a young girl, she would have started making gagging noises. Then she almost did gag because right in her shadow she felt the stain that was the Turinika ambassador. She turned slowly, crossing her arms and looking down at him. "Something I can do for you, Mr. Tika?" she asked, and her tone very much conveyed there was very little she was willing to do at all. "Field Marshal Simmons." The bird-like ambassador seemed to want to be anywhere other than where he was right then. "I have come with word from the Conclave about my government's—" He paused, then tried again. Well, my government has come to a decision about what to do with the... Again, he paused. Well, the situation regarding the enslavement of my people, and God alone knows how many others. Simmons cut the ambassador off. She didn't have time for his demure politeness right now, or patience. Continue. Yes, well. The Turinican ambassador twisted his neck to the left, then to the right, then lightly ruffled his feathers. I regret to inform you that my government has declined to accept your request. Silence hung in the air. Several in earshot simply stopped what they were doing to turn and stare at the Turinican. Tika's entire body was seeming to tense up, and she saw the way his eyes were dilating. She stared cold daggers down at him. Anything else? She asked, crossing her hands behind her back slowly. The long, thin legs of the avian slowly pulled up and then down. The conclave is prepared to... The ambassador stopped talking, then seemed to slowly collect himself, steeling himself. Simmons said nothing, knowing that this was being watched. The conclave is prepared to offer our human property to you. He said the words as if they were his own death sentence. In exchange for this boon, the conclave demands a pact of non-aggression. What are the chua? Simmons asked, already knowing what this meant for the future. There would be no deal. There would be no peace. The ambassador's government had all but openly declared war themselves. Forgive me, Field Marshal, but my government does not see your perspective the way I do. Tika rattled off in a series of chirps, clicks, and whistles, rapidly translated in Simmons' ear. They do not believe in your society a species like the chua would be treated as, well, equals of same value. Go on, Simmons said, cutting the ambassador off again. Tika took a long moment to respond. His eyes looked to one of the chua who was standing nearby, watching intently at the exchange. The request for the chua to be returned was dismissed, he said slowly, and once again he was picking up his feet, slowly raising his wings. His neck was distinctly curved into an S, his wings arching hard, and to Simmons it looked almost painful. Simmons didn't know what he was doing, even as he lowered himself slightly. Allow me to extend my personal apologies for this outcome. Simmons turned her back on him and closed her eyes. She heard the light padding of the Turinika's feet on the decking of the Antares. She felt her face getting hot, her anger starting to build. She had just capped off the most devastatingly one-sided victory since Hannibal had defeated the Romans at Cannae, and this Turinika was basically telling her that his government had given them the equivalent of, fuck you, pay me. She was about to round on him when she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. It was the crewman from before, the same one who had picked up the signal from the Chua homeworld. As she turned her gaze on the crewman, he glanced over to the ambassador and back to her, and mouthed one word. She raised an eyebrow, then glanced at the Turinika again before looking back to the crewman. Once more he mouthed the word, shame. Simmons made a motion with her eyes towards the ambassador, and the crewman nodded his head once. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. Then she turned fully back to Tika, who stood in the same pose. He slowly was lifting one foot, then the other, bending it and setting it back down. You should be ashamed, she said, ice in her voice. Resend the message. Tell them this wasn't a request because I'm not asking anything. Your people will release mine and the Chua. You will release all the rest. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She simply spoke. The avian was still lightly prancing in place. You will give them back to us. We are not asking for it. We're telling you what you'll do. Tika slowly began to prance backward from her. Of course, Field Marshal, of course. Tika continued his slow dance, his neck bent in sharp angles, his wings arched high. I will relay your words to the conclave right away. As he continued to back away, his legs began to straighten, his neck began to loosen, his wings slowly folded back to his body. He turned and began to head towards the door. Simmons watched him go, then turned and headed over to the crewman who sat at the comms terminal, who hurriedly began to stand up from his seat. She looked to his nameplate and rank as she approached, and waved him back into his seat before he could get fully out of it. Petty Officer Hazard, she said, placing her arm on the console and leaning against it, seeing in her peripheral vision his supervising officer coming over to join them. How in the hell did you know what he was doing? It was part of a lesson I had in nonverbal cues from when I was in linguistics. They had some of the visual cues for certain species that we had the information on. The crewman said rapidly, "That was one of them, Field Marshal." "Well, no shit," she said, raising an eyebrow. As the officer in charge of the crewmen came to his side, Field Marshal Simmons glanced up at her, a rather striking-looking dark-skinned woman with light hazel eyes. "I want a promotion on his shoulder and a commendation on his chest," Simmons said, and she tried not to look as the crewman's mouth suddenly hung open. "And any time I have to talk to that ambassador, I'll need him. He seems to have a talent for hearing and seeing things, and unlike my uncle, the things he hears and sees are actually there." The crewman's mouth slowly closed as Simmons stepped away, feeling the hand of his divisional officer come down on his shoulder. The commendation was a high award, but she had to say the man had earned it. He had heard the chua signal when no one else did, and he had already proven himself useful again when he could have just sat back. Speaking of which, there was another matter to consider now, considering she was in the middle of giving awards. After this battle, there were going to be more than a fair few to be issued, and Petty Officer Hazard was not going to be the last. As she walked back to the table, she began to move through a few displays, checking on the status of the repairs on the Antares dry dock. She wanted to be moving, but for the next 12, no, probably 24 hours, she was going to be stuck here. The inaction chafed. She glanced around for a moment, then pulled out her data pad, placing it on the table. She flicked a few icons and brought up her personal storage. A moment later, a picture appeared on the screen, shown two-dimensionally. She stared down at the man in the picture and smiled to herself, looking at the kind eyes of the man on the screen. Dressed in a Mars orbital construction uniform, he, like her, did not show her age. His expression was calm. She could feel his patience radiating from the picture like an aura. Slowly, she placed her fingertips on the picture. "I could use you out here," she whispered. "I'm bouncing off the walls just like you said." His eyes seemed to sparkle with that "I told you so" attitude that had riled her up so many times in the past. She missed him, especially in moments like the one she was experiencing right now when she wanted to throw the ship into the next system and disregard caution like a bad idea. He had centered her, and she had made sure he lived on his toes. "How bored are you right now?" she whispered with a smile down at the picture. After another moment, she closed the picture and pressed a panel on the table to raise her station. She began to compose a message back to Earth, detailing what the Turinika ambassador had said. She considered adding Petty Officer Hazard's observation, but didn't. She was still writing when the hazel-eyed ensign walked to her side and whispered, "We are picking up a signal. Hazard is pushing it through to your station now, Field Marshal." She glanced over to Hazard, who was working his console, and a moment later a blinking icon appeared on her station screen. She tapped it, and a video feed opened, expanding outwards until it filled her station. She couldn't figure out the species, but what appeared to be a rabbit with small ears was making low grunting sounds. She glanced over to Hazard, who was continuing to work the console, when finally the speech cleared up. "Controlled. Lines have been drawn only to be stepped over again and again, and nothing was done. The threat that the Vral posed to the security of us all has been proven time and again, and before their disappearance, the humans tried in vain to offer a hand to be taken. We did not reach out that time to take the hand of the humans. We only sat in our barrows and waited for the Vral to come for the next and the next, until they came to us." "Oh, this is interesting," Simmons said as she leaned over the display as the figure continued speaking. "The resurgence of the humans and the chua have proven that the Vral can be beaten. We may be late, but we reach out our hand now to the Terran front. As of this moment, we of the Baraki Order formally declare a state of war between ourselves and the Vral Empire." The Baraki continued to talk, but Simmons couldn't hear anything else. "Are we recording this?" she said, looking to the ensign, who looked at Hazard. "Are we recording?" she yelled, and Hazard nodded quickly. Simmons turned her head back to the screen. "Call. The fleets of the Baraki will stand alone for now, until such time as we are joined in victory. To our neighbors it is time to stop simply observing the wrongs that have plagued so many others. It is time to stand, as the Terrans say. To those of the Terran front, we come to your aid, perhaps late. But you do not stand alone. We will join in their mission, as it has been said to me, to reunite the lost and the taken, and to remove this threat to our corner of the galaxy that has remained for far too long. The Baraki took a step back from the podium they were standing behind, and she saw a human walk into the frame and curl his fingers like paws and lightly touch them to the Baraki's proffered limbs. As the angle of the recording widened, a chua was standing near the man, and some other massive snake-like creature that Simmons once again was confused at the sight of. Sudden recognition came over her, and she barely restrained herself from yelling. Instead, her voice came out as a whisper. "Willis, you little bastard, what have you done now?" She smiled like a shark and glanced to the ensign. "I need a priority 1 channel open to Earth as soon as possible, maximum encryption, and I need this file attached." She looked back down at the screen, which was now frozen, the last frame of the message held in place. She quickly pulled up her hyperlane map and looked for Baraki space, 5 jumps distant. She smiled at the screen as she began the lines of the hyperspace routes. Their new friends were practically neighbors.